you're in the right spot, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. Today we are talking about a relatively new tool that Unity released. It's not even officially released. It's still very much in preview. But this is a tool specifically designed for AEC, where it bridges the gap between BIM tools, CAD data, and Unity in real-time rendering. So with that said, let's go ahead. In classic presentation fashion, let's go ahead and take care of a few housekeeping areas. We'll talk about the agenda, what we're going to be talking about today, how we'll make this as practical as possible for you guys, what you should expect. And then we'll go into a few feature demos. All right, so a little bit of background here. So Damien gave me an awesome introduction. Thanks again. I'm the director of design at a Unity development agency, or rather an XR development agency called KairosXR. We specialize in developing occupational training content. So we work across healthcare, AEC, really the enterprise space, building XR training tools rather than games in that case. And I'm joined here today helping out with the QA and another excellent Unity developer, I should say an excellent Unity developer. I really can't handle like the self promotion, if you will. But Andy, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'm Andy. I'm the Director of Technology at KairosXR, and I will be helping Tim out today with some support and manning the chat, the QA. So any questions you have, feel free to drop them in there, and either Tim or myself will be able to answer those.
Cool. All right. So we know that we're here to talk about Reflect. Reflect is Unity's tool. So what are some of today's goals? Well, we want to get you from 0 to 1 as efficiently as possible, which means that we're going to get you downloading and we're going to get you set up with Reflect. And I know Damon said let's use Slack for all of our questions. We'll be keeping an eye on Slack, but we'd also like to keep an eye on the chat feature here. So if anybody has any comments, particularly enthusiastic about anything, by all means, drop that into the chat. With that said, this is going to be more of a demonstration rather than an interactive workshop. And the reason being is because there are a few barriers to entry when it comes to Reflect. First of all, you do need to have a Unity Pro subscription. And second of all, you do need to have a Reflect license as well. And right now, they give you a 14-day trial, which is fantastic. And you can really get to know the tool and see the true power of it, and really see how it can optimize your workflow. But with that said, you do need to get that license in order to use it. So anticipating that not many people in the crowd today have the license or Unity Pro, I'll go ahead, I'll demo a bunch of stuff, and then we'll chop it up with QA at the end. So we're going to start today with a little bit of background. We're going to start with the why. First of all, why are we worried about the CAD workflow and the BIM data workflow, especially as it pertains to Unity? Well, we know Unity is a real-time 3D engine, and it's particularly well suited for immersive applications. So building out virtual reality, building out augmented reality, but also building out interactive desktop 3D as well. Originally built as a game engine, but as of the last few years, if not more, they have taken a hard turn towards the non-gaming sector because of the advantages in real-time rendering. And then that's where the bridge comes in, or rather that's where CAD and BIM data tools come in. So most of the people in the crowd, just based off of the signups and personal predictions, many people are familiar with the CAD and BIM tools. For instance, Revit. We'll be using Revit today to exemplify the tool. So in the past, it's been very, very difficult to get your models into Unity. Even more so, getting your models into AR and VR, specifically because of performance issues. So that's why Unity built Reflect. Reflect is the bridge between your CAD and BIM software and Unity. For those who want to take the models, rather than export as an FBX, for instance, want to maintain the integrity of the CAD data, rather than converting the file type and then dumping into Unity, which is effectively a one-way road as well, they built Reflect so that you can instantaneously, literally with one click, bring your models into Unity, and then into AR, and then into VR, or just desktop. We'll be spending the majority of today working with the desktop tool, but we'll be taking a look at mobile AR as well. Okay, so I should say, first of all, that I don't represent Unity. I'm not trying to sell this tool. I just happen to be authentically and genuinely excited about this tool. So, and the reason being is because of use cases and videos like this. We have many professional architectural and construction firms already using Reflect. Let me kill the volume on those to bring their BIM and CAD data, again, into Unity, into their Unity projects. You have a few use cases or a few examples on the left, and in the middle there, it's a short video. And then, of course, we have the Shaw architects who are actually featured at Unite, talking about their direct experience using Reflect in their projects. It's advantageous, sure, from a design standpoint, but also from an educational standpoint, from a client education standpoint. So it has that training component as well. But it's particularly advantageous because of the reduction in development time. It is, as I mentioned, literally one click away from augmented reality, desktop 3D, and virtual reality. So we talked about the goals. So what are we actually going to talk about today? Well, we have, you know what, I'm going to, of course, I'm just like looking at my head talking here. Let me go ahead and kill my camera if it's okay with you all. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, again, we're going to be covering the overview, and then we'll spend a little bit of time with the tool itself. On the right there, you can see a video. It's the augmented reality version I captured last night, just in haste, to demonstrate what we can do with it, of one of the standard Revit example models. So as you can see, we spawn the model in the floor, and literally one click later, we have an AR application to view it. So we'll be going over that. We'll be going over the basics, and we're going to go over how do we actually pull that into AR. And then we're going to take it to the next level. One of the challenges of today is the balance of feature overviews and demonstrations, but then also practical information, because we are here at a hackathon. So we want to make sure that you're leaving with practical information so that hopefully you can incorporate this into your hackathon projects. So just out of curiosity, I'm going to pause there. I know we have a few chat messages coming in. Let me just check that out. Cool, it doesn't look like. So we do have one question in regards to Mars. So Mars is a relatively new tool as well. In fact, it'd be great if we had a workshop on that, now that I think about it. But Mars is a connection bringing your immediate surroundings back into Unity. So think of it, one of the use cases is creating true to scale and true to environment environments. And when I say true to environment, I mean your real environments in your virtual environment. So whereas this comes from, this is data coming from a 3D modeling tool, Mars enables a connection between the absolute real world and those interactions with the real world and pulling that back into your applications. So we can talk about that offline, or if we have, we will have a designated QA section later on, but we can talk about that in a little bit. Cool. So we mentioned what is Reflect. Again, Reflect is the bridge. Reflect is a bridge between your modeling tool, your 3D modeling tool, Revit, for example, and then into Unity. And why is this particularly useful? Well, we know that there were, in fact, ways before to get metadata from your models. For instance, I believe there's a particular type of FBX model, for instance, that can carry metadata. But it was previously extremely complicated and time intensive to get to incorporate your CAD workflow into the real-time engine workflow, or rather Unity. So again, we have that bridge. I think I've made my point there. What's particularly useful for designers, however, is access to that BIM data. So all of the tags, categories, families, all of the information comes through with the model. And from there, Unity actually has a Reflect library. You can take full advantage of all of the metadata to, on one hand, continue to modify your designs, to programmatically modify your designs, for instance. And we'll get into some of the top use cases or common use cases for that data shortly. All right, so here's another example. I mean, this is the Unity example video. As you can see, and we will be doing this live as well, but we build out the model in the beginning. We built out the model in Revit. We have a plugin as well. You export it into Unity. I'll bring it back a little bit. And then we have this menu on the right. So given that this is only just one more minute, we'll pause here and we'll keep on taking a look at this. And I mentioned that one of the advantages being the time reduction, and that's specifically because of the live sync. So as you can see on the left, and by the way, this is a real video, that's not doctored. On the left, you can see immediate changes in your project, which are immediately updated in the Reflect, or the Reflect viewer. So having that immediate back and forth reduces iteration time, saves money, reduce costs. So I mentioned that Shop had that video earlier as well in that interview. Here's another example. That brief clip there was an example of Shop using it for one of their skyscraper projects. Another core feature in Reflect is the time scale or the time lapse. So again, using categories and target dates in Revit, you pull that over and you can see a full time lapse of the construction of the project as well. And that's one of the features that we'll implement today. And then, of course, this is a final example of the fidelity that Unity can achieve, especially with the high definition render pipeline. And by the way, if you do have any questions about the high definition render pipeline, boosting graphics versus boosting performance, feel free to drop those in as well. Andy, who's helping out at TA, he goes deep with HDRP, so happy to dive deeper. So I threw a lot of information at you. And again, the goal there was just to build the context and to build a foundation before we actually start diving into the tool. I hope at this point you understand how powerful Reflect is, especially if you've worked with Unity before. So we want to open up, give you a quick space here. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in. If not, we'll keep on diving. Awesome. So it looks like we are ready to go. And just out of curiosity, for those who are brave enough to engage in the chat, how many aspire to work with Reflect in the near future? Also, another question for everybody, again, to be answered in the chat, but how many people have never opened Unity before? Awesome. Hey, Victor. I remember you, Victor and I have been slacking back and forth. Good to have you here. Great. So, okay, given that there wasn't a resounding, I work in Unity every single day from every participant here, I will slow down. Hey, Viviana. I'll slow down when I go through the Unity examples. So again, we build that foundation. Okay, so let's get into it. How to reflect. What exactly is Reflect? So Unity Reflect it comes in the form of a plugin for Unity itself, the actual editor, but also a standalone build. So an actual executable file that you can download. Now, if you're working on your desktop and you don't have Unity and you do want to view a model, you would download the Reflect view. Now, that's an application for Windows machines. To my knowledge, they don't have one for Mac. Though, Andy, I'd like you to keep me honest there. Maybe you can check on that for us, but I'm pretty sure they don't have it for Mac. You download the file onto your Windows machine, and then you can view your models once you, once you open up Revit Andy just clarified, it is usable on Mac. Fantastic. So my executable file is not, but it does have a file version for Mac. And once you open up the application, you will open up this viewport. So I'm going to do that right now. I'll demo it. The big takeaways is to demonstrate how easy it is to build out VR, AR desktop in Unity. One final note here is that a seemingly unlimited number of people can download the viewer and sign into your account to view the model. Now, whenever we hear unlimited, and this is literally what I read about the product and heard from the Unity team, it's never actually unlimited. So keep that in mind. But for all intents and purposes, it is. So I'm going to go ahead and hop into the viewer. Don't need to kill the presentation. Also don't need to do that. Bear with me. The wizard behind the screen here. All right. I'm going to open up Reflect. Right, so what did you just hear? So Unity does have a relatively goofy opening for their the Reflect view, or the Reflect viewer, I should say. And again, this is an executable file. I downloaded it, and because I have an account, and again, you do have to go through a process to actually sign up for Reflect through their licensing hub. Once you sign up for it, you have access to this. You sign in. If you hadn't signed in, then you'd be prompted at the upper right here. And then you have this live feed, this window of all the projects you have access to. So let's go ahead and take a look at some projects right now. I preloaded these. We're going to go through the load process shortly, but we can open Reflect 3. And just like that, we have our model. And for those who are familiar with Revit, again, this is going to look very, very familiar. We can orbit around the scene. We can look around the scene. We can also fly around the scene. Perhaps more interesting is the option to go into AR or VR. Here's our live sync button. And here's a filter feature. So what is live sync? Again, I already mentioned this, but if you make modifications to your file in Revit, we want those to be reflected in our project immediately. And when we toggle live sync on, though it slows down the performance, it brings in those changes immedially.
Hey Tim, I think we're just seeing the slides still. Maybe that's just on my end, but I want to double check. There we go.
For those who have been with me, that happens at least once every single presentation. Andy, thank you very much for hopping in and mentioning that. So let me run that back. So you open up the Reflect viewer. This is what I was just describing. It's our home menu. Previously, we wouldn't have seen the model that's right behind it, but you do have your login right here. If you aren't logged in, if you don't have a registered license, then you'll be prompted to do so at the upper right. And again, if you have updates to your projects, you can update the project. And then you can open up any of the projects that you have exported into Reflect. So we have Reflect 3. We're gonna keep that open because that's open right now. So we'll close that down. And this is what I was describing. We can fly around. We can look around. We can orbit. So you start to get the point. And again, we're going to walk through how easy it is to get a project in here very soon. So I was just pointing out a few of the UI features. Right now, we're just going to get accustomed to the UI. And then we're going to dive into the export process. So I was describing the second button here. Toggle into VR mode or AR mode. AR is for mobile. VR is for Vive or even Oculus platforms as well. I just mentioned live sync. Again, live sync, you toggle this on and you immediately get changes in real time from your projects, your Revit projects. And I was about to just dive into this filter system. So this menu that pops up is a reflection of the metadata. So if we look at categories, then we can see all of the different furniture, all the pads, everything that's tagged, again, previously in Revit in our project. So we can see exactly where they are. And then on top of that, we can also kill their view. So if we only wanted to look at, well, if we only wanted to look at railings, for instance, we could go through and we could toggle everything off as well. So the fun does continue. There are a few tools that come with reflect as well, such as sun study. You can modify the latitude as well if you do need environmental data. Modifying the longitude, latitude, and north angle. And then lastly, we have performance versus post-processing. Let's turn these back on. So if we kill the post-processing in our scene, we're going to have a highly performant application, but it's not going to look great. So we can turn on our post-processing just like that. Cool. So that was a quick run through of what the viewport actually does. And by the way, when we're working in Unity, we have access to all of these features out of the box as well. But of course, we're here at a hackathon. So actually learning how to use a tool isn't that much help. We want to learn how to actually implement it in our project. So let's go ahead and check that out. And first, I'm going to make sure that I'm actually sharing with Revit. All right, Andy, quick sound check or gut check. Are we looking at the same thing? Are we looking at Revit?
We see Revit here, so all good there.
All right. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, so here we have our Revit model. And again, we are just looking at that. And let's back up here. So let's go out. Perhaps you'd see a top bar just like this. And when you do download that file, when you download the viewport executable, the next time you open up Navisworks or Revit or any of the CAD BIM softwares, you'll have a new window at the top. You'll have a new dropdown. And now we have this new export view and start. So live sync, well, let me break down the difference between these two. Export view is how we actually get the project into Unity for the first time, or into that viewport for the first time. We'll do that in just a minute with a modified model. However, the difference between start and export in this case goes back to the server. Start directly communicates with the server. Unity stores all the models on their Reflect servers as well. And sometimes the live sync can be a little slow because the server isn't responsive. So the start button here is a manual way to kick that into gear and open up the live sync. But let's go ahead and just kill a few. We'll delete that. Oops, sorry folks, hit the wrong button there. We're just going to continue to delete a few things just so it's a noticeable difference in the model. And once the model is in a position that we're ready, all we do is hit that export view. We hit the export view and it opens up our Unity Reflect menu. And again, this is now the repo. This is the menu for all of our projects. We can create a new project or we can just jam it into another project. So you see the full workflow. Let's go ahead and create a new workflow or a new project. We're going to do a Reflect, Revit Live. And a gotcha, make sure you hit export. If you don't hit export, then it won't actually go through. All right, so it thinks some more. Let's go back to our Reflect view. And let's go ahead and open that up. So you saw it thinking a bit there. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. Here's the project. Let's open it up. And there it is. It builds. So as you can see, if you have your professional workflow dialed and you're working out of Revit or, again, any of those other tools, now you have your product in an amazing viewport, or a viewer, as they like to call it. But this isn't very helpful if we want to build more custom logic, right? We need access to the code, or we need access to the metadata explicitly. How do we actually further customize this? How do we add our company's logo to this viewport? How do we add additional buttons at the bottom? And let's go ahead and dive into that, because again, our goal here is to teach you practical information because we're at a hackathon and we're hoping that you will incorporate this in your projects in some capacity. All right, so I'm going to hop back to the presentation and I'm going to pause there for a moment. Do we have any questions? Any big burning questions? And I will take the lack of chat activity around those questions as no. There are no burning questions, which is fantastic. Great. So mentioned as well that Reflect has a few target platforms, or mediums, we should say, not platforms, but there's a VR viewer, there's a mobile AR viewer, and a desktop viewer as well. I don't have a VR headset with you, otherwise I'd be doing a VR demo. And we have this awfully convenient video of AR implementation I took last night, so don't need to wire up my phone now as well. But again, those are the three primary mediums. So the next phase is about importing into a Unity project. As it stands, the best or most compatible version is 2019.3 with Unity, or so says their documentation. So we are going to be working in a 2019.3 project. I believe it's 2019.3.15. And we're going to be working through the actual asset import process. So let's go ahead and do that. And by the way, we're testing this machine a little bit, given we're live streaming, screen recording, working with Revit and Unity wide open. All right, I'm going to do a new share. Double checking that share. Looks like we are good to go. So when you open up Unity, the first step here is to bring in Reflect as a package. And taking a step back, what are we doing? Let's level set here. The learning objective is for you to understand how to actually set up Reflect in your Unity project. Why would you ever use Unity instead of just using the viewer? Because again, Unity opens up a world of custom logic and custom interactions, general customization, from polish, post-processing polish, UI polish, to additional interaction features, those buttons, for instance. In addition to custom logic around the metadata. And the metadata obviously is the most important part of this whole thing. So in order to get this set up in Unity, you go to Window, Package Manager, and make sure that you are looking at all packages and preview packages. Again, Reflect is still in preview, so you won't be able to get any further if you don't toggle on show preview packages. Look around, Unity Reflect, it's already installed. If it weren't, you'd say install at the bottom here. Wait for it to think and load. And just like that, you have everything you need in your project. When the package comes in, it's not going to be in the assets because the package manager doesn't actually put anything in your assets. It puts it in the packages, right? So you'll have a new Unity Reflect package at the bottom here. And to get started, all you have to do is find the Reflect prefab and drag it in. So literally just dragging it in. So let's dissect that a little bit. What exactly is the Reflect prefab? Well, everything that anybody would ever need to customize their Reflect experience is right here. It's effectively a large UI with a bunch of managers on it, or a bunch of scripts holding logic. What we're going to pay primary attention to is the canvas. And if we look at the canvas, we'll start seeing a lot of familiar vocabulary. For instance, sync. What is sync? Let's take a closer look. Actually, now that I'm doing this, yep, here it is. So you can see, though it is covered up, we'll get that out of the way. We have our sync button, which should look very familiar. So if we ever wanted to customize this, we could do so just by accessing these buttons. A few gotchas before we continue. Many people, when we run these workshops in the past, many people say, okay, this is great. You're helping us get the lay of the land. And how do we actually add our own buttons? How do we actually continue to customize this? And yes, we will get there. But an important gotcha is the sync top menu. So if you do want to add your own buttons, the critical ingredient here is to add the sync top menu component, because that locks up the rest of the UI until it's actually called. So once you toggle on once you toggle on the button to actually toggle on the functionality or other UI, everything will be turned off until the scene actually starts. And then you can toggle everything on. So again, the takeaway there is remember to add the sync top menu to every one of your canvases. Excuse me, I was saying sync top menu. There's a corresponding top menu script for all of these. I said sync because this is a sync canvas, but again, every one of these objects has its own corresponding top menu script. Easily replicatable as well. All right, so what happens if we hit play? Is this really ready to go? All right, we definitely need to turn off the we need to turn off the music there. It's going to drive me crazy. So we know that we were working to Reflect Live. Well, this should look very familiar. This is what we were just looking at when we opened up the project. And again, it's the exact same functionality here, guys. We have direct access to the application. The only difference is that that was a build, and now this is directly in Unity. Cool. So how do we actually import additional models? Well, you can't do it during runtime, but you'll notice that you have this new window, the Reflect window. So you can open up the Reflect window, and here you'll see these new tabs. Every project that you have stored on the Reflect server will be represented in this project window. And if we've already imported them into the project like I did with the Reflect Demo 2, we can update it or we can locate it. Now, if we have a new project, which we do with the Reflect Revit Live, we can import that. It does take a second to load. And while that's loading, let's remind ourselves what are we doing or why we're doing this. So why not just stream it in at runtime or load it at runtime, which is what we just saw? Well, there are instances where we want to further customize the model. For instance, maybe we don't want to, maybe we want to manually add materials to very specific objects in the scene, disassociated from any kind of metadata. In that case, we would be able to pull in the model itself. We have the Reflect, now we have the Reflect Revit Live folder. Pull in the model itself. Oops. And now we have access to the model for further customization. Cool. So that's it, guys. I mean, that's how you import your models. I mean, it's literally that easy. The trick, the full workflow is getting it from Revit. Once it's out of Revit, export it. Again, you drop it into your menu. Once it's in a project or associated with a project, that's when you can pull it into Unity and import it that easily. So let's keep on moving because we don't have an incredible amount of time here. I promised Damon that I'd try to keep this to about 45 minutes. Great, so we went over how to import an asset. Here are the steps. Damon mentioned that this will be recorded and this will be published, so we wanted to include a few sample slides here, or reference slides as well. So as you view the video, you'll have this as a reminder. We already walked through how to update imported models.
Tim, we're at the Unity screen share here.
Yep. Yep. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Thank you, Andy, for the reminder. So I just hopped back into the presentation. So as you mentioned, we're continuing on. Let me double check. Andy, since I'm not hearing from you, I'm assuming that it's good to go. So here's a reference slide for importing the asset. All right. We spoke to how to update the imported models as well. And now let's get to the next step. How do we actually design with Reflect? So a few common use cases. This comes down to metadata. And a few concepts or use cases for that metadata in the workflow is materials, time-lapse, control lighting, or controlling the lighting in the scene, modifying the transparency of specific objects, programmatically adding or procedurally adding audio to objects as well. And then even adding nav mesh and adding procedural or procedurally placing certain objects. So that could be procedurally placing trees around your scene, for example. Or it could be adding certain AI characters. If you wanted to add a bunch of people or animated humanoids, You can procedurally do that instead of placing them all individually. So I mentioned that the time-lapse is a really popular tool. When I was playing around with this, actually, I found that there was a bit of a bug. So we're not going to dive into it. What we will do, though, is go over the actual workflow for it so that you're familiar with the workflow. First, we'll kick it off with the time-lapse, so you understand what to do in regards to metadata and then what that means for Unity. Then we're going to dive into swapping materials. So based off of how these objects are tagged, how can we find those tags and then swap out the materials altogether, which is helpful for presentations, again, for client education or sales, or even safety for that matter. And then controlling lights is another example. So if we wanted to turn lights on or turning lights off, again, we search through the project for that metadata, and then through script, we can toggle them on and off. And I mentioned the concept of procedural environment creation as well. So again, in this case, these cylinders are just examples of what humans would be doing. They also move around. The GIF got cut off, unfortunately, but typically these cylinders would be walking around. Or capsules, excuse me. So let's go ahead and dive into that before we head into our conclusion. So beginning first with the time lapse. Looking for Unity to share. Actually, you know what? Because it's more conceptually straightforward, let's go ahead and open up our material scene. So again, let's start with what we're actually going to do. Yes, we are here in the goofy thing. It's in every scene, by the way, so you're gonna have to bear with me. We'll go back to the beginning, and let's scroll around. So right now, we are finding all the objects that are tagged with floors in the scene, and we're going to modify the category, floors, with this red material that we made. So, assuming that everything goes according to plan, in runtime, we can hit these three dots, and we can change materials. Yes, and it worked. So what happened there? How do we actually set that up? And how is it using the metadata? Well, again, I mentioned that Unity has its own Reflect library, which gives us a bunch of tools to look through the project and find that metadata. So if we were to turn this off, then we would lose the color and we'd lose the attention as well. So let's keep that on so you understand what we're talking about. So change materials is really the only thing that we need to do. The only thing you need to add to your project is this change materials or swap materials component. So again, this is just a custom script. This isn't anything special. But what's important is that it's using the Reflect library to look through all of the metadata. So let's take a look at the code here, or rather to set it up. Again, we type in anything. We could type in ceilings. We could type in walls, for instance. Actually, I'm not sure if anything's tagged with walls. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like there's nothing actually tagged with walls. But if there were something tagged with walls, then they would all turn orange or red. And the only thing this script is saying, guys, and again, here's Unity engine.reflect. The reason why we're diving into this is so that you can use it in your own projects. Let's see. It finds the data for each of for each piece of data in the data list. Again, we're giving it the parameter, the category, which we set up in Revit. So we have category, which is a public reference here as well. The category to change. And again, we manually add the walls. So Unity loops through all of the metadata in the project, looks for anything tagged with walls, or in this case, or before it was floors. And then when it finds an object with the data associated with it, that's when it makes a change. Cool. So the next step here, let me going back, and I'm intentionally not sharing again, is controlling the lights. So how might we control the lights in this case? And again, recognizing that Unity is not necessarily a spectator sport, that's why we have these preset scenes. So in interaction, in order to set up light control in the scene, we add the light controller game object with the lights control attached to it as well. So let's go ahead and actually just kill that for now and set it up from scratch. So when you open up the canvas, when you open up Reflect, we added a new canvas here. We added the lighting canvas, which again is just the exact same. We just added the top menu script to it, and we have a few buttons as well. Let's see. So if we go down the hierarchy here, you'll see that we have two buttons, the text light on and the text light off. If we open up those buttons, you'll see that the root, which usually is not supposed to have that attached to it until we manually add it, the root object for the Reflect prefab has the lights, controls, game object attached to it, of which we just drag in. We drag the root into the button, lights, controls, and we set it up so that the first one, light on, turns on the lights on enable, and then the second one, lights off, turns on the lights on disable. All right, so now when we hit play, we're going to get the goofy noise again. We should be able to turn on and off the lights in the scene. And again, these lights are tagged with light, which is why Unity can find them. Oops. Apologies, a little overzealous. Cool. And when we turn on our light button, which doesn't have an icon, you can see that they're turning on and off. Cool. So let's go into the final round of customization before we dive into the rest. Again, and when I say the rest, it's the last bit of the presentation. So I promise you that we talk about the timeline again, because the timeline's a little buggy with how it's interpreting the metadata. Also, by the way, it takes quite a bit of time to go through every project in your Revit file and tag it with the appropriate data. So with that end, or with that said, it's important to recognize the new canvas here, which we call the completion canvas. And the completion canvas has a slider attached to it. That slider is responsible for measuring the time scale. And the script that does all of the work in this case is certainly not that one. Yeah, okay, so it's the completion date slider. So the completion date slider script. That's what keeps track of all the dates. So in Revit or in any of your BIM or CAD projects, you will tag each object with the target completion date. You import that into Unity or into the Reflect server, and then you'll have access to that new category, and then you can modify it with a slider. Now, what happens, because many of us enjoy working with Unity because of the post-processing, or rather because of the high fidelity capabilities. So what happens if you want to modify what those post-processing effects look like? Well, you can do so. Let's go back to our first sample here. You can do so by finding the, wait for it, here it is, the free cam controller. You can modify both the post-processing profile and the controls for the camera. So what are we talking about right now? What happens if you want to move quicker? What happens if you want to move quicker in virtual reality or augmented reality or WASD, for instance, if you're using the desktop? If you're using the desktop and you'd like to modify the locomotion, you can do so in the free cam controller. And again, we can increase the scroll sensitivity. Let's double it to 10. We can increase the touch zoom sensitivity, which again is only relevant for mobile AR. You can increase that to 200, for instance. And then all of a sudden, you're increasing your locomotion throughout your project. And I mentioned that you can modify the post-processing as well. So the post-processing volume, so those who are familiar with post-processing, Unity has a fantastic post-processing stack that adds a really nice layer of polish. It's their polish tool to add richer shadows or richer lighting or more realistic lighting, for instance. Now there is a toll, it's not free, there is a performance hit, but you get an additional boost of fidelity. And that's what I'm referring to right here, is the post-processing volume. So how do you polish the scene? You can do so by modifying the post-processing profile and adding additional overrides. Okay, so if you have any questions about post-processing, follow up with Andy or myself afterwards. This workshop is not about post-processing, but we've literally run entire workshops on post-processing in the past. So this is impossible. Talking about post-processing in 5 minutes is not doing it justice. So let's set up a time to call or hop on a call. Also, you can reach us in Slack if you have any additional questions here. But again, in terms of the UX of the viewer, you will modify all locomotion interaction in the free cam controller and the post-processing for that aesthetic. All right. So let's go ahead. I'm going to share this one last time. Damon, you'll have to excuse me. I famously went over time. So as a challenge for everybody, again, you should have access to this video, so you'll have reference to these slides. But as a challenge to you, see if you can figure out how to set up a procedural design system for environment creation. So how to use metadata to create a nav mesh. There are resources available. We're always happy to hop on as well. But which tools within Reflect will enable the this procedural creation. The hint here, as always, are on the side. So adding it to the root of the Reflect, you'll add something called the nav mesh helper. And then from there, you'll configure everything, including the humanoids. And then you'll hit play and populate the scene. Which begs another question. Oh, let me guess, we're not on. Yep, we're on the presentation, awesome. So it begs another question, what else can you do with metadata? How else is it used? So I just gave you a few examples there with the light controls and with the materials as well. But what else can you do? Well, you can add certain audio effects. So what happens if you have a bunch of wind turbines, which we did in that scene, or maybe you have a bunch of trucks, or maybe you have a big engine in the scene. And the closer you get to it in Unity, the more noise you want it to make. Well, you can procedurally add these audio effects if it has the right tag associated with it. So audio effects is one. Rigid bodies and colliders. So if you want to have realistic physics, one of the best use cases for Unity, or one of the biggest advantages of Unity, is their physics system. So taking advantage of rigid bodies and colliders. And again, if you'd like more information on rigid bodies and colliders, we can talk about that as well. Just let us know. A more enterprise-centric use case is, again, safety hazards. And Andy and I mentioned, or I mentioned that Andy and I build occupational training content, and for probably 90%, maybe over 90% of our AEC training projects that we've built have all revolved around highlighting safety hazards in some capacity. So it's not just about client education, but very much about onboarding new workers and all that, using it as a safety training tool. Viewing different layouts as well. So you can procedurally place different objects around based off of their metadata too. So you don't need to design the layout anymore. You can design entire cities. And then of course, creating points of interest as well. So if you have some kind of site tour associated, if you wanted to go from point A to point B to point C to point D, and this is pre-designed, then you can set up these quote unquote points of interest and teleport to these points of interest again, procedurally, using the tags. So I hit you with a lot. I know it's a lot of talking. It's not very interactive because it's the nature of having a block system like that. But what else can you do? Again, you can customize the UI. You can further modify the post-processing effects. As you continue to play around with this, really recommend that you take it a step further. And if you bring it into your projects as well, certainly customize the UI. Certainly customize the post-processing. Because hackathons, you don't have a ton of time. And sometimes just paying a little extra attention to the polish can make a really big difference. So what did we just talk about? We just talked about the BIM workflow within Unity. We have a taste now of how to use Reflect with Unity. And then connecting, of course, CAD and BIM to your Unity projects. What will you do now? Well, there are other AEC workshops coming down the pipeline. Damien's about to announce some really awesome workshops, so check those out as well so you're well prepared for the hackathon coming up next week. And if you are interested in diving deeper into Unity, I mean, again, we just took 50 minutes to go into a massive tool, Reflect. If you'd like to dive deeper into user interfaces or just an intro to Unity, or perhaps you have a team to get trained, that's what Andy and I do, half the time. The other half are developers. So follow up in regards to these workshops as well if you'd like to learn more. And then lastly, got to practice. You got to build out those passion projects. You need to build out the professional projects. This isn't a kind of tool where you can just go to one 50-minute session and expect to retain all that much. So keep on working at it, build that familiarity, and then build that mastery. Thanks again for coming, guys. If you would like to reach out on LinkedIn, you have both of our LinkedIns and that bit.ly link there, and our emails as well for more personal questions. Exciting to talk more.